When a serious crime is committed and the police need all the help they can get, there's one group of people they turn to time after time.
Expert witnesses are the golden thread that runs through cases that every single conviction needs.
An extraordinary army of men and women with the expertise to reveal the hidden clues criminals have left behind.
There are so many important pieces of evidence: paint evidence, glass, fibre evidence.
They search harder and look deeper using the very latest techniques.
If I can work out how old those insects are, that's going to give me the minimum time since death.
This is the inside story of how science helps solve some of the UK's most complex cases.
It really was becoming the last throw of the dice.
Nothing's going to bring her back, but she'd have the justice that she rightly deserved.
This is the story of the expert witness. Today, how the work of two expert witnesses proved crucial in solving the notorious murders of Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman.
They used the media very effectively, so it was on every single TV programme. Everybody, I think, was holding their breaths and praying that they would be found alive and well.
And how advances in forensic science allowed one expert witness to identify the killer in a murder cold case.
It was one of the first major examples of DNA cracking a cold case, 16 years on from the murder.
When we use forensic geology, we look at the details of the rock and often the soil that's involved in the case. There are quite a number of techniques we can use that enables us to produce a really unique result that will match a suspect to a crime scene.
When I go to a crime scene, it's everything. It's the soil itself, the vegetation, the amount of light, the creepy crawlies that are there. It all builds up to a picture, and one can get an enormous amount of information for the police.
August 2002, Cambridgeshire. Two young girls, Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman, are reported missing from a family barbecue. Like many of us, crime journalist Ron K. Phillips still remembers the case 20 years later.
Once their families realised they were missing and they'd been reported to the police, there was a really intensive search to find them. And they used the media very effectively, so it was on every single TV programme. Local people joined the hunt. It really, everybody, I think, felt and was holding their breaths and praying that they would be found alive and well.
This evening there were countless volunteers assembled outside the girls' school.
An image taken the very day Holly and Jessica went missing now filled TV screens across the country.
The thing that's incredibly poignant is the photograph was taken just hours before they went missing. They were at a family barbecue having a wonderful time, and a few hours later, well, you know what happened.
Former Assistant Chief Constable Alan Mains conducted a review of the case for Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary and Fire and Rescue Service. He studied every detail of the hunt for Holly and Jessica.
The team on the ground were overwhelmed, I think, by the media attention. They need to get the message out, and as an investigator, we would use the media quite a bit to get our message out, to get sort of appeals out, and it's been very, very productive. So, but there's a balance to that, and the world descended onto Soham over the next couple of days after the 4th of August. And that was hard to manage. It really is, the sort of first 4 to 6 hours is your golden opportunity to get them back safely. When it sort of goes beyond that, then you really do have to start working through the worst case scenario.
Less than 2 weeks later, the girls' bodies were discovered by walkers in woodland 20 miles from their home.
It was the news the nation had been dreading. The discovery of 2 bodies in thick woodland next to the RAF base at Lakenheath.
In the interim between the girls going missing and the recovery of their bodies, the investigation team had really pulled together a core group of experts, and even that, they were bringing a lot of value to the team. They were starting to make sure that the information that they were getting was properly assembled.
Forensic ecologist Patricia Wiltshire was among that team and attended the crime scene.
When I got there, lots of people, lots of police officers, lots of people dressed up in white, with the press in adjacent fields with their cherry pickers. You feel very exposed, but it wasn't very pleasant. But of course, the crime scene is critically important. That's where you're going to pick up clues as to who's been there. So you have to take your time. The police wanted to know when the girls had been put into the ditch. Well, at a quick look at the vegetation that had obviously been, I found the path, it had been trampled. I could see what had happened. But of course, that's not good enough. You really need to corroborate that.
For Patricia, trampled nettles found at the scene of the crime were key to calculating when the bodies were left there. So she designed an innovative experiment.
We set up a scenario with at a local field centre where they were in a very protected place where there were banks of nettles, and the warden actually walked in with heavy weight on his back twice. And then he photographed those nettles every day. And we watched their recovery. And they behaved exactly as the nettles did at the site. And after about 12.5 days, we got the same number of nodes, the same sort of distances between the nodes. So I said to the police, that confirms it's about 2 weeks. And they were shocked because it was exactly 12.5 days that the girls had disappeared and then they were found.
Patricia's experiment showed the girls' bodies had been placed there shortly after they'd gone missing. Meanwhile, the investigation had identified a prime suspect, Ian Huntley.
Whenever the police are at the early stages of an investigation, they rule nothing in or nothing out. So everybody potentially is a suspect until they are no longer. And that's the way you have to have an open mind. I think Huntley became very much to the fore in a lot of the media, and indeed in the searches as well. He was putting himself up there as somebody who was trying to help.
28-year-old Ian Huntley was a caretaker at the local school. His manner with the detectives and inquisitiveness about the case caught the attention of the investigation.
One of the community safety police officers came in to work. Huntley came up and started to chat to her. She was very, very good to sort of suss and think, you know, that's a bit suspicious, asking about how long does DNA last for. And she reported it back into the command and control, and somebody there sensed it as suspicious and then started to escalate from there.
Police interviewed Huntley. He lived nearby and said he had spoken to the girls the day they had disappeared. Detectives searched his home.
Police officers noted a strong smell of cleaning substance, and that automatically pulled your suspicions right up there. And the washing on the line, when it was raining, all the things that people wouldn't do in the ordinary course of their everyday events. And this was something that they had to look at closer.
Police began a forensic investigation of Huntley's house and his car. In both, they discovered red fibres matching the football shirts worn by Holly and Jessica when they disappeared. But Huntley had an explanation.
He then comes up with this story that they came in with a nosebleed. And that's all, you know, that's very credible in the sense that it happens. And the fact that he was at the school, where there might have been a common bond, known them and been familiar, and more importantly, being at ease with them. It's the investigators that have to prove it beyond reasonable doubt, not Mr. Huntley. It's like a strand on a rope. The more strands you can get, the thicker the rope is, and the more evidence that you would gain to bring it before a court and before a jury. And therefore, if you were just taking it on fibre evidence, you would have to really make sure that whatever he said is rebutted.
Detectives continued their hunt for more evidence. They searched the school where Huntley worked and found some upsetting evidence. Patricia Wiltshire analysed the football shirts for clues to how they got there.
All embedded in that clothing were bits of vegetation, particularly the fruits of alder trees that were hanging over that ditch very densely. And so the alder fruits and other things told me straight away that the girls had been clothed when they were in the ditch.
The red fibres at his house and the football shirts at his place of work were incriminating evidence against Huntley. But neither placed him at the location where the bodies had been hidden. For that, police turned to expert witness and forensic geologist Andrew Moncrief.
If you don't have any evidence linking a suspect to a murder victim after they've been killed, then you've not really got that all-important link, because contact while they're still alive can be explained in all sorts of ways, as it could in this case. And you really do need that link very often with the body deposition site.
Police had possession of Ian Huntley's car. Now they asked Andrew to look for evidence that could link it to the crime scene.
I did what I would always do, which is first of all to go to the site in question and see what's there. As I walked down the track and started digging a trial pit down through it, I really did get quite excited, because I could see that we were dealing, amongst many other things, with chalk. And chalk is extremely valuable forensically. Chalk itself is very widespread in the British Isles, one of the most common rocks on the surface. And the lovely thing about it is it contains millions upon millions of very, very tiny fossils. And those fossils have been used extensively to date the rock very, very accurately. So you know exactly where you are within the chalk.
Andrew took samples of the chalk for analysis and then turned to Huntley's car. If it had traces of chalk matching the location where the girls' bodies were found, then Andrew could place Huntley at the scene of the crime.
You can find geological samples all over a car. You'll obviously find material on the tyres, very often sprayed up onto the wheel arch, maybe up the side if a car's been stuck in a muddy area. The problem with all of those things is that they are not one-off events. The wheel arch of a car will have material in it from hundreds of miles of driving. Likewise, if you find a fragment of rock lodged in a tread of a tyre, how do you know where it came from? It could have been picked up from almost anywhere. The beauty about the deposits that I found on Ian Huntley's car was where they were. They were lying on the top of the front left suspension arm. Now, that's not a place where you would commonly find material lodged. It had to have been picked up in a single event by the car being driven over a pile of rocky soil and taking the top off, a bit like a boiled egg, if you like. So it represented a single event. We had a sample uncontaminated by any other locality. It had got in the car on one occasion, and one occasion only, and that made it very powerful.
Andrew sent the chalk samples from the car and the crime scene for analysis.
Lo and behold, in very short order, back came the results. They were all exactly the same.
But Andrew needed to go even further and prove beyond doubt that there was nowhere else Huntley's car could have picked up chalk matching the crime scene.
The last thing you need to do in this sort of exercise is often what we call control sampling. You have to go out and actively look to see if you can't find this stuff somewhere else. We know it can't have come from further south than Cambridge because it was the wrong type of chalk, it was the wrong colour, the wrong hardness. We know it can't have come from north of King's Lynn, once again, wrong type of rock. Now, because the area is so low-lying and chalk is so soft, almost all of that is covered by fields, forests, roads, whatever. You don't see a lot of chalk outcropping when you drive around East Anglia. So really you're looking for places where it's been dug up, and that means ditches, quarries, things like that.
Andrew and his team analysed chalk samples from dozens of such sites and even considered which were accessible in a Ford Fiesta. But they concluded the only possible match was the sites where the bodies were found. Police now had evidence tying Huntley to the crime scene.
First of all, a bit mind-blowing to the investigation team to prove absolutely beyond doubt that that's what it was in terms of the chalk and to the site and whatever else. That's just fantastic work. It really is fantastic, and it just illustrates the very important part that the scientists play.
Detectives charged Huntley with the double murder of Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman. His trial began in November 2003 at the Old Bailey in London.
The trial, just like the search for the girls, attracted not just nationwide attention, but worldwide attention. Everybody just holding their breath and wanting to know what the outcome would be.
You go up in there and you take the oath, or you affirm, or whatever it is, and you look up. And there's all these journalists whose faces you recognise from the television. And it takes quite a moment to settle down and to think about what you're going to say and how you're going to say it.
Both Andrew and Patricia explained their evidence to the court. It had an immediate effect on the trial.
Just after we'd given our evidence, the barrister stood up and said, "My client wishes to confess."
Following Huntley's last-minute guilty plea, he was sentenced to life in prison to serve a minimum of 40 years.
I am proud that it made a difference. I think it's probably true that the geological work on the investigation was important. Forensic geology doesn't work well that often. But if it was going to ever work, I'm so glad it worked well on that case.
Roy Green is a forensic scientist who specialises in using DNA to solve cold cases, but it's not always like you see in the movies.
Yeah, because of programs like CSI, people seem to think that there's the DNA and you can just test it and you know, yeah, it's his and the case solved. It's so much more complicated than that.
(1983) Merseyside. 50-year-old Cynthia Bolshaw is discovered face down in her bath at her home in Heswall on the Wirral. Cynthia was a divorced mother of one who worked as a beautician. The press quickly dubbed the murder the Beauty in the Bath. Local crime journalist Mark Thomas covered the case as a young reporter.
Cynthia Bolshaw worked as a beautician at a fairly exclusive department store called Brown's in Chester. She had a fairly sort of glamorous background, and she also had quite an active social life to go with it, as was to emerge during the case.
Cynthia was living alone at this house in Heswall in 1983.
Cynthia's body was discovered by her sister and brother-in-law when they went to visit her. Were surprised to find that there was no answer. They went into the house and unfortunately found her body lying naked, face down, in the bath. This is Buffs Lane, Heswall, which is the scene of the murder. This is a fairly affluent, quite well-off area, sort of a leafy little suburb. It was not the kind of neighbourhood that really one associates with violent crime, and it came as quite a disturbing thing to happen in such a quiet community.
Police searched the house and recovered nightwear along with Cynthia's personal diary.
Cynthia's diary contained the names of over 200 men and details of the relationships that she'd had with them. So it provided a huge resource in terms of potential clues, and in some ways that presented, of course, a massive challenge, because it meant that all these people had to be contacted and eliminated from the inquiry. It was one of the largest scale murder investigations that Merseyside police had ever done at the time. there were upwards of 100 officers actively engaged on it. They actually had a squad of detectives who became known as the Boyfriend Squad, whose job was only to go and interview all the various boyfriends that Cynthia had had to try and establish whether they had alibis for the night of the murder.
Detectives had hundreds of suspects, but one by one, they were eliminated and the case went cold. For the next 15 years, Merseyside police made annual appeals for information about Cynthia's murder, but got nowhere. Then, in 1998, advances in forensic science offered detectives new hope when they turned to expert witness Roy Green.
In 1983, DNA profiling hadn't been invented yet, but 15 years later, when I picked up this case, it certainly was. And so the main thrust of the examinations was to try and find something that might produce a profile which might have come from the offender.
The pathologist's report showed Cynthia had had sexual contact very soon before she died, and the original investigation had found a mark on Cynthia's nightwear. Detectives were convinced it had come from her killer, but could not reveal an identity.
They'd found some staining on the negligee, and they'd carried out grouping tests, but it really hadn't been that informative. And the thinking was that really there wasn't anything left.
Now, Roy wanted to use modern DNA analysis to try to identify the killer. But there was a problem. The sample no longer existed.
Now, that item had been examined for semen. During that process, they'd found a stain and cut it out, which is part of the normal forensic process at that time. And that had then been tested. But it wasn't there anymore.
Roy needed to think of a way to retrieve a new sample from the nightwear.
Part of the process for finding that body fluid is to wet the item with a spray and then apply blotting paper that's damp. The idea is you're looking for a chemical that's present in high quantities in that body fluid, and it's very hard water soluble, and it soaks into the blotting paper, and then when you spray it, it'll turn purple if that particular body fluid is there.
Roy considered the fabric around the edge of the hole left when the earlier sample was removed. Could this have absorbed some of the fluid needed to run a DNA test?
What we did was we cut around the hole and then put that in for profiling.
Despite the fact 15 years had passed and the original sample was missing, the process returned a profile.
Well, we were quite pleased we got a profile, but of course it didn't match anyone so, at the time. But that sparked the police into making a press appeal. Could anybody who knows anything about this case come forward and help them? Because they did have new evidence that might help solve it.
This time, the public appeal delivered a major breakthrough. One of the men mentioned in Cynthia's diary was John Taft, the director of a double glazing company. He'd been interviewed by police, but was ruled out as he had an alibi provided by his wife. Now, she was ready to provide new information.
The key witness who came forward was Barbara Taft, who by that point was Taft's ex-wife. They had split up by then and got divorced. She had been asked by her husband to basically provide him with an alibi for the night of the murder. He had told her that he had been at the house to do an unofficial double glazing job for her, but was worried that if he came forward and told the police that, then he would immediately become a suspect just because of him having been in the house on the day. In fact, and it may be a little bit of an omission in the investigation at the time, Barbara was never questioned by the police, so never got to make that decision of whether to tell the truth, or which was in fact that she'd been away at the time, or whether to back her husband's story. It was a huge breakthrough because suddenly Merseyside police had somebody who had definitely been at the house on the night when Cynthia was murdered, which was, you know, in itself a large step forward. So he instantly became a person of very significant interest to the investigation.
Police re-interviewed Taft. He maintained his innocence and even volunteered a DNA sample.
When we got the DNA result back from the negligee, the statistic it gave was 680,000 times more likely if that DNA had come from John Taft rather than someone related to him. But about that time, we were going to use a new DNA system, and we applied that system to a bit more of the extract, and the probability of that result was 160 million times. So the finding was 160 million times more likely if that DNA had come from John Taft rather than someone unrelated to him.
It was a huge breakthrough, and it was one of the first major examples of DNA cracking a cold case. 16 years on from the murder, here we suddenly had science providing an absolutely essential piece of evidence that was to lead to the conviction of a killer.
John Taft's alibi had been a fake, and his DNA had been detected at the scene of the crime. He was arrested and charged with Cynthia's murder.
The trial lasted for 10 days. Taft protested his innocence throughout. When he got to give his evidence, he did admit that he had been at Cynthia's house and that he had made love to her, which is something that he had not admitted for the full 16 years previously. His account was that when he left the house, she was alive and well.
I gave evidence in this case, and it was important to get across to the jury that the result we'd got was from semen, and that it was on an item that was at the scene of the crime, and therefore it was relevant, very relevant.
The jury were convinced by Roy's evidence. They found Taft guilty of murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison.
I think the jury got that one right. You do realise that whenever you provide a statement that it's just a small part of what the jury will hear, but in this particular case it was a pretty important evidence.